Welcome back, you guys, to lesson number 4 in our Unit 2 on formulas and constructions. Today, our objectives will be we will be able to use a compass and a straight edge to construct a perpendicular bisector and a perpendicular to a line from a point on or off the line. We will also be able to use the words supplementary, linear pair, and vertical angles to describe the angles created by the intersecting lines. Now let's talk about some vocabulary first. Supplementary angles are angles that add up to 180 degrees. Angles that add up to 180 degrees. Complementary angles are angles that add up to 90 degrees. Now we're not going to talk so much about complementary angles today. We're mostly going to focus on supplementary angles. Let's look at a couple of angles here. Let's look at this very acute angle, and let's just assume this has a measurement of 30 degrees, and then we have this obtuse angle that has a measurement of 150 degrees. If we do the math, add them up together, 150 degrees plus 30 degrees, that will give us 180 degrees. So these two angles that we drew here are supplementary. Now remember, if we draw a straight line, that line creates an angle which is already 180 degrees. And if I now go ahead and draw another line intersecting our first line, those two lines together will form two angles. Let's look at a little angle. Let's just assume that this one is 30 degrees and the larger one is 150 degrees. Then we can see that together the two of them are 180 degrees. So two angles that are together next to each other on a line, they also are supplementary because together they form an angle of 180 degrees. Now, for those particular types of angles, we have another word, and that word is linear pair. And when you see linear pair, then focus on that part that says line. A linear pair is two angles that are adjacent, in other words, next to each other, and on a line, and they are also supplementary. So if two angles are next to each other and they are supplementary, then we call them a linear pair, and it's because they're adjacent next to each other on that line. Let's talk about vertical angles. If you have that line from before and we intersect it by another line, we see that we actually form four angles, right? So we have two acute angles, and those acute angles, and let's again assume they have a measurement of 30 degrees, they are actually congruent. So angles that are vertical angles are angles that are made by an intersecting line, or I should say intersecting lines, two of them. They are across from each other and they are congruent. So our two acute angles are congruent, and so will be our two obtuse angles. And I'm going to indicate that by my congruent marks. And we already, looking back at what we said about our linear pair, we can already say that those two obtuse angles must have a measurement of 150 degrees, right? Because with the angle that's adjacent to it, both of them form a 180-degree angle or straight angle. In other words, if two lines intersect and you get the measurements of just one of those four angles that are created by those two lines, you can then figure out all the other ones all by yourself. All right, let's move on to some constructions. Our first construction is a perpendicular to a line through a point on the line. So we start off with a line and a point on it. In other words, given a line and a point on that line, we now have to create a segment. So we take our compass and put the center of it on our point, and now we need to adjust the width of our compass to make sure that it's smaller than both sides. Yes, that works fine for us. And we're now going to make an arc on both sides of our point. You could also, of course, go ahead and make an entire circle. If it lets me do it, here we go. But you don't need to do that, okay? It's okay with just having those two intersections, the arcs, and those arcs will mark off our segment. So we have now created 2 points in equal distance from our point P, and from those 2 points to each other, that's a segment, and we don't need the rest of that entire line. So we draw 2 arcs from the point on the line. To make a segment. To make a segment. And from now on, we just bisect the segment. You have already done this. Remember how we did that? We take our compass and go to each one of the endpoints. Now we have to make sure that we adjust our width, that we make it a little wider beyond the midpoint, right? And we're going to draw an arc above the midpoint and an arc Remember how we bisected the segment? We move our compass to one of the endpoints, and now we have to adjust our width, make sure that it's wider than the midpoint, and we are going to draw an arc above and another arc below that midpoint. And then we're going to move our compass to the other side, to the other endpoint, without changing the width. This is very important, without changing the width. And we are drawing another arc. And now we have two additional points that we have created. And now we just use our ruler to connect the two lines. Excuse me, the 2 points, of course, is what I want to say, by drawing a line, and this line is perpendicular. Remember how we can use the edge of our ruler to put it right there, and we can see that it's a perfectly nice 90-degree angle. So we can also make a 90-degree angle mark right here. Why is this one 90 degrees? Well, if this one is 90 degrees, then the linear pair, the adjacent angle, also has to be 90 degrees. Together they are 180 degrees. In other words, all 4 angles are 90 degrees each. And again, this is just how we did it before, bisecting the segment. So we draw an arc above and below the line from each of the endpoints. Then we mark a point where each 2 arcs cross each other, and we connect the 2 points with a straight edge. Now let's move on to our next construction. Now we're going to construct a perpendicular to a line through a point not on the line. Now we start off with a line and a point not on the line. So we are given a line and a point not on the line. And what we do first is we draw 2 arcs from the point to mark of a segment. So again, we create a segment, and remember, we always start off with the center of our compass on that point. Now let's make sure that our compass is opened wide enough that we can, maybe not that wide, that we can reach the line on each side and draw a nice little arc. On both sides, and now we have created 2 endpoints for our segment, and we don't need any other part of our line. So let's note this down together. Draw 2 arcs from the point that is not on the line to mark the segment. And guess what, you guys? Now we are again going to do the same thing that we did before. We bisect the segment. One more time, we are now going to bisect the segment. Let's do it together one more time for practice. We mark 2 arcs from each of the endpoints One is going to be below, and the other one is going to be above our line. Now technically, do we even need that arc above? We already have our point that's off the line. We wouldn't need it, but it's just nicer to get into the habit to both. And from our other endpoint, without changing the width of our compass, let's do our two arcs. And we have created our 2 points, which we can now connect with our straight edge. Nice straight line through those points. Using my straight edge, I see that we have right angles, and so we did it well. This concludes our lesson number 4 on constructing perpendiculars. Make sure you have your notes completed, and we will practice with compass and straight edges in class. See you there.